It was the kind of night where the rain seemed relentless, drumming against the windshield in a steady rhythm. I had just finished my shift at the small-town diner where I worked, my body buzzing with leftover adrenaline. The highway stretched ahead, dark and empty, flanked by dense forests on either side. There weren't many streetlights out here, just pockets of darkness interrupted by the occasional neon glow of a distant gas station. That's when I saw her. A woman stood on the side of the road, drenched to the bone, her thin arms wrapped around herself. She wasn't waving, wasn't making any motion to get my attention, but something about her made me slow down. Maybe it was guilt. Leaving someone out in this weather felt wrong. I rolled down the window just slightly. "Do you need a ride?" I called out. She turned to me, and I immediately felt something shift in the air. Her face was gaunt, her eyes dark and sunken. She was tall, almost unnaturally so, and her wet clothes clung to her frame like a second skin. She nodded slowly, stepped forward, and slid into the passenger seat without a word. The smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic, filled the car. I swallowed hard and forced a smile. "Where are you headed?" Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Just a little further down," she murmured. I nodded and turned back to the road. The windshield wipers fought against the rain, casting quick, eerie shadows across her face. I kept sneaking glances at her. There was something about her posture, the way she held herself rigidly, staring straight ahead without blinking. Something was off. A mile passed, then another. The silence between us felt thick, suffocating. "So, you live around here?" I asked, just to break the quiet. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head slowly, so slowly, and looked at me. I mean, really looked at me, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "You should have kept driving," she whispered. I felt a chill shoot down my spine. My grip on the wheel tightened. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the road, her expression blank. I should have pulled over. I should have told her to get out. But I didn't. Another mile. Then, suddenly, she whispered, "Stop the car." I hesitated. "Are you sure?" "There's nothing out here." "Stop the car." Her voice was sharper this time, more urgent. I pulled over, heart hammering against my ribs. She didn't move at first, just sat there, her hands resting on her lap. Then, finally, she turned to me again. "Thank you," she said softly. And then she was gone. She didn't open the door, didn't step out. She was just gone. I stared at the empty passenger seat, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The door had never opened. The seatbelt was still fastened. I swore under my breath and threw the car into drive, speeding away. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep control of the wheel. By the time I got home, my nerves were shot. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and collapsed onto my bed. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying the moment she vanished. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard something. A creak. The unmistakable sound of a door opening. I shot up, my pulse roaring in my ears. The house was silent. Too silent. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight as I crept toward the living room. The front door was closed. The windows were locked. But there, in the corner of the room, was a shape. A shadow that shouldn't have been there. And then she stepped forward. It was her. The woman from the car. Only now, she wasn't wet. Her clothes were dry, her skin pale as death. Her lips curled into that same not-quite smile. "You shouldn't have stopped," she whispered. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Then the lights flickered. And she was gone. Again. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. A hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But when I went outside to get into my car, my stomach dropped. The passenger door was open. And there, on the seat, was something that made my blood run cold. A single, waterlogged footprint. I never drove that road again. Story 2. The storm rolled in faster than I had anticipated. Thick clouds swallowed the moon, leaving the road ahead barely visible through the sheets of rain. I clenched the wheel, my knuckles wide as I navigated the twisting highway through the dense forest. I had been driving for hours, desperate to make it home before midnight, but the weather had other plans. Then, I saw him. A lone figure standing at the side of the road, his thumb outstretched. His jacket was soaked through, his head bowed slightly against the downpour. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. I've watched too many horror movies to make that mistake. But something about him, maybe the way he seemed so utterly lost, made me hesitate. I slowed the car. The rain distorted his features, but as he stepped closer, I could make out his face. He was young, maybe in his early 20s, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed too heavy for his face. He leaned into the window, his breath fogging the glass. "Can you take me just a few miles up the road?" His voice was smooth, almost too calm. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. He slid in, bringing the scent of damp earth with him. As I pulled back onto the road, he sighed, running a hand through his wet hair. "Thanks. I wasn't sure anyone would stop." "Yeah, well, bad night to be stuck out here." He chuckled softly. "Yeah, bad night." Silence filled the car. The only sound was the steady drum of rain and the occasional whoosh of trees as we sped past. Something about him made me uneasy. He sat too still, his hands resting motionless on his lap. Every few minutes, I could feel his eyes on me, watching. I cleared my throat. "So, where you headed?" He didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he murmured, "Home." I nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. "Cool. You live around here." Another pause. "Not exactly." His answers were vague, almost deliberately so. I decided to let it drop. I just needed to get him to where he was going, and then I'd be on my way. We drove for another 10 minutes before he spoke again. "You should have kept driving." I frowned. "What?" He turned to me fully this time, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "You shouldn't have stopped. You shouldn't have let me in." A chill crawled down my spine. My mouth went dry. "What are you talking about?" He tilted his head slightly, as if considering his next words. "This road, it's a bad place to stop." Something about his tone made my skin crawl. I kept my eyes on the road, but my heart was racing now. "Why?" He didn't answer. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then, he whispered, "You'll see." My stomach twisted. I wanted to tell him to get out, to pull over and leave him on the side of the road, but something inside me warned against it. Instead, I pressed my foot on the gas, speeding up. The sooner I got him out of my car, the better. The road curved sharply, and as I rounded the bend, my headlights caught something up ahead. A car, or at least what was left of one. It was crumpled against a tree, its front end smashed inward like an accordion. The windshield was shattered, the roof peeled back as if some enormous hand had torn it open. My breath caught in my throat as I slowed the car. And then I saw the body, slumped against the hood, barely visible through the rain. I turned to my passenger, heart pounding. "Shit, do you see?" But he was gone. The seat beside me was empty. My chest tightened. My hands shook as I reached out, feeling the seat. It was still wet, still warm. I slammed on the brakes, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. And then I heard it. A soft voice, whispering from the back seat. "You should have kept driving." I turned slowly, every muscle in my body locking up. He was there, sitting in the back now, his dark eyes staring at me through the rearview mirror. But something was wrong. His face looked different. His skin was too pale, his lips tinged blue. And then I realized. The body on the hood of that car. It was him. A scream caught in my throat as the car suddenly lurched forward, as if an unseen force had taken hold of it. The headlights flickered. The radio crackled with static. I clawed at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The rain outside intensified, hammering against the windows. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The car sat motionless. The headlights were off. The road ahead was empty. I turned again. He was gone. The only sign that he had ever been there was the wet imprint of his body on the seat. I don't remember how long I sat there, too afraid to move. But eventually, I forced myself to start the engine. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I drove straight home, locking every door and window the moment I stepped inside. The next morning, I checked the local news. There had been an accident on that road. A fatal one. A young man, in his early 20s, had crashed into a tree during the storm. He died instantly. The article included a photo. It was him, the man I had picked up, or the man I thought I had picked up. I never drove that highway again. Story 3. The rain had started hours ago, a steady drizzle that had turned the empty back roads slick with mud. My windshield wipers fought to keep up, smearing water across the glass in rhythmic, hypnotic arcs. I had been driving for too long, the highway stretching on endlessly, swallowed by forests on either side. That's when I saw him. A lone figure standing at the edge of the road, barely illuminated by the dim glow of my headlights. His clothes were soaked, his hair plastered against his forehead. Something about him made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way he just stood there, motionless, his arms hanging limply at his sides. But the rain was unforgiving, and the idea of leaving someone out in it gnawed at my conscience. I slowed down. He stepped forward, his movement stiff, unnatural. As he approached the car, I finally got a good look at him. He was young, maybe in his early 20s, with sharp features and hollow eyes that seemed impossibly dark. I rolled down the window just slightly. "Need a ride?" He nodded once. A single, slow movement. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. He slid in, bringing the damp, heavy scent of the storm with him. For a few moments, we sat in silence, the rain drumming against the roof of the car. "Where are you headed?" I asked finally. "Just up the road," he murmured. His voice was quiet, almost distant, as if he were speaking from far away. I nodded and pulled back onto the road. The tension in the car was thick, pressing against my chest like a weight. I could feel his eyes on me, watching, unblinking. Minutes passed. Neither of us spoke. Then, suddenly, he whispered, "You should have kept driving." A chill crawled up my spine. "What?" He didn't answer. He just turned his head, staring out the rain-streaked window. I tightened my grip on the wheel. Something felt wrong. We drove past a rusted road sign, its letters barely legible through the darkness. "Last stop motel, 2 miles ahead." I stole another glance at my passenger. His clothes were soaked, but now I noticed something else, something that sent my heart into overdrive. His jacket. It was clean. Too clean. The rain should have darkened it, left streaks of mud along the hem. But it looked untouched. And then I saw his hands. His nails were black. Not from dirt, but from something else. Something that looked an awful lot like dried blood. My pulse skyrocketed. I think I need to pull over," I stammered, forcing a nervous chuckle. "I should check the tires. The road's pretty bad." He turned to me then, a slow, deliberate movement. His face remained unreadable. "No," he said. I swallowed hard. My hands were slick with sweat. I couldn't tell if it was the heat or the panic creeping up my spine, but suddenly, the car felt suffocating. The last stop motel came into view. A rundown building with flickering neon lights and a single rusted pickup truck parked out front. It looked abandoned. I made a split-second decision. I yanked the wheel hard, skidding into the parking lot. The tires screeched against the wet pavement, the car jerking to a halt. Without thinking, I threw the car into park and reached for the door handle. And then I felt it. A hand. Cold. Clammy. Wrapped around my wrist like iron. I turned slowly. He was leaning toward me now, his dark eyes filled with something unreadable. "You shouldn't have stopped," he whispered. My breath hitched. Who are you?" A slow smile crept across his face. Not a friendly smile. Not even a human one. "You already know," he said. And then he let go. The second his grip loosened, I shoved the door open, stumbling out into the rain. My heart was hammering against my ribs, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I turned back to the car. He was gone. The passenger seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. The seatbelt was still fastened. He had just disappeared. I stood there in the rain, my body trembling. The last stop motel loomed behind me, its neon sign buzzing faintly. I had no idea what had just happened, if I had imagined it, if I had picked up something that wasn't supposed to be there. I forced myself to get back into the car, my fingers shaking as I gripped the wheel. And then I saw it. The rearview mirror. There, sitting in the back seat. A figure. Hollow eyes. A slow, curling smile. "You shouldn't have stopped," he whispered. The lights flickered, and everything went black. Story 4. It was a long drive home, one I had made 100 times before. The back road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by towering pines that swayed in the night breeze. The radio crackled, the station struggling to keep a signal this far out in the middle of nowhere. I sighed, adjusting my grip on the wheel. That's when I saw her. A woman standing on the side of the road, her arm outstretched, her thumb barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. Hell, I was the type who triple-checked the locks before I went to bed. But something about her, maybe the way she stood there, soaking wet, shoulders hunched against the cold, made me hesitate. I slowed the car. As I got closer, I could see her better. She was tall, almost unnaturally so. Her long, dark hair clung to her face, her pale skin ghostly under the flickering streetlight. I rolled down the window just a little. "Need a ride?" She nodded. A slow, deliberate motion. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed don't. But the night was cold, and she looked desperate. I unlocked the door. She slid in silently, her wet clothes leaving damp stains on the seat. I fought the urge to shiver. The air in the car had dropped several degrees the second she got in. "Where are you headed?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay light. "Just a little further," she murmured. Her voice was strange, hollow, like an echo of itself. I gripped the wheel tighter. The silence between us thickened as we drove. The only sounds were the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers and the faint hum of the radio. Then she spoke again. "You live alone, don't you?" I stiffened. "What?" Her lips curled slightly. Not quite a smile. "You live alone." It wasn't a question. I forced a laugh. That's a weird thing to ask a stranger. She didn't respond. My stomach twisted. Every instinct told me to pull over, to get her out of my car. But something about her made my hands stay glued to the wheel. Minutes passed. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless. Then, softly, she whispered, "You should have kept driving." I glanced at her. She was smiling now. My blood ran cold. I slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. The car jerked to a stop. I turned to her, my breath coming in sharp gasps. "Get out." She tilted her head, amused. "I'm already home." And then she was gone. Not gone in the way a normal person would leave. The door hadn't opened. There had been no movement. She had just disappeared. The seat was still damp where she had been sitting. I stared, heart hammering. Then, the sound of my front door unlocking. My body went rigid. Slowly, mechanically, I turned my head. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I could see my house. Dark. Silent. Except for the front door. It was swinging open, as if someone had just stepped inside. My vision blurred. My ears rang. I was still in my car. I hadn't moved. But somehow, she was already in my house. The lights inside flickered. Then footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Moving through my home. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking. A shadow passed by the living room window. She was inside. I turned the key in the ignition so fast I nearly snapped it off. The engine roared to life. I peeled out of the driveway, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped away. I drove. I didn't look back. I don't know where I went that night. I just kept driving until the sun rose, until my eyes burned with exhaustion. By the time I finally worked up the courage to return home, the door was locked. The house was empty, but I never slept there again, because I knew she was still inside, waiting. Story 5. It started with a storm, the kind that rolls in fast, swallowing the sky in thick, black clouds. I was driving home after a long shift, my eyes heavy, the rain hammering against the windshield in a steady rhythm. The highway was nearly empty, stretching out into nothing but darkness and trees. Then, just ahead, a figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought I imagined it. But as I got closer, I saw him clearly, a man standing perfectly still, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat, his clothes dark and soaking wet. I should have kept driving, but I didn't. I slowed the car. The second my tires skidded on the wet pavement, I felt something shift. The air grew thick, suffocating. But I ignored it. Instead, I rolled down my window, just a crack. "Hey, do you need a ride?" The man lifted his head. For a moment, I swore I saw nothing beneath that hat. Just darkness. Then he nodded once. A slow, deliberate motion. Against every instinct screaming inside me, I unlocked the door. He slid in silently, bringing the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, with him. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was wrong, too dense, too heavy. Then, finally, I asked, "Were you headed?" His voice was smooth. Too smooth. Just a little further. A chill ran down my spine. "Rough night, huh?" I tried to keep the conversation light. He turned his head toward me slowly, and for the first time, I saw his face fully. Or at least, I thought I did. It was strange. Wrong. Like his features didn't quite fit. His eyes were too deep, his skin too smooth. Almost like a mask. "You should have kept driving," he murmured. I gripped the wheel tighter. "What?" His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You shouldn't have stopped." The air in the car plummeted. My breath came out in short, shaky gasps. I swallowed hard. "Listen, man, if you want me to pull over." "Too late," he whispered. Then the radio cut out. The screen flickered. The car's interior lights blinked wildly. And suddenly, the man was gone. I slammed on the brakes, my chest heaving, my pulse hammering against my skull. The seat beside me was empty. But then a voice. Not beside me. Behind me. "I'm still here." My blood turned ice. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. Then cold fingers wrapped around my shoulder. I screamed. My body jerked forward as I threw the car into drive, not caring where I was going, not caring what was behind me. I drove like a madman, my vision blurred, my heart pounding so violently I thought I might pass out. By the time I reached my house, I was drenched in sweat. My hands trembled as I yanked the keys from the ignition, bolted from the car, and locked the door behind me. But the second I turned around, my stomach dropped. There, on the living room floor. Wet footprints, leading deeper into the house. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, reaching blindly for my phone. Then, a whisper. Too late. The lights flickered, and everything went dark.